Real nightmares.
The bunker was barely holding together, much like the men inside. Heavy artillery rumbled in the distance, sending vibrations through the cracked concrete walls. Private Martin wiped a thick layer of dust from his rifle, though he knew it wouldn't matter much if the enemy broke through. Supplies were running low. Ammo, food, morale. The faint hope that reinforcements might arrive had withered away days ago, leaving only silence punctuated by distant booms and the occasional radio static. Captain Rhodes crouched in the corner, his face etched with exhaustion. "How much longer do we have to hold this damn place?" a soldier asked, his voice thick with frustration. Rhodes didn't answer. He just stared at the map splayed on the floor, its edges stained with coffee and blood. It didn't matter anymore. Every hour that passed was another hour of survival, and nothing more. Martin glanced at the others. Sergeant Blake, silent as always, sat cleaning his knife with meticulous care. Corporal Harris sat slumped against the wall, muttering something about home under his breath, words barely audible. The bunker had a way of making you feel trapped, not just physically, but mentally, as if the very walls were pressing in, waiting for them to crack. "We just need to hold out," Rhodes finally said, though his voice carried no conviction. "They'll come for us. They have to." The words hung in the stale air, but no one believed them anymore. They had been fighting for weeks, maybe months. It was hard to tell anymore. What had started as a simple mission had devolved into this. Being stuck, buried in a bunker surrounded by death. Martin felt something cold brush the back of his neck. He turned, expecting a draft from the shattered ventilation shaft, but the air was still. Something wasn't right. There was a heaviness in the room that went beyond exhaustion or fear, something unspoken that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Outside, the enemy crept closer, but inside the bunker, an even darker force seemed to stir. Martin's shift came that night, as the others dozed in uneasy sleep. He sat at his post near the bunker's entrance, rifle balanced on his lap, eyes scanning the narrow corridor that led into the dark, abandoned rooms beyond. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio and the far-off thuds of artillery. The coldness from earlier returned, this time creeping up his spine. A shiver passed through him, more than just the damp chill of the bunker. He squinted into the dim passage, barely illuminated by the flickering emergency light. That's when he heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Martin." His breath caught in his throat. He gripped his rifle tighter, the cold metal suddenly heavy in his hands. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice breaking the stillness like a gunshot. No one responded. A faint shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. Martin stood, heart racing. His boots scraped the concrete as he approached cautiously, the whispering continuing, growing fainter, pulling him deeper into the bunker's bowels. His light flickered once, twice, before stabilizing, revealing a figure standing just ahead. The figure wore old, tattered military gear, its features obscured by shadow, but something about it felt deeply wrong. It looked up, eyes hollow, face pale as if drained of life. Before Martin could react, the figure dissolved into the darkness. He stumbled back, adrenaline flooding his system. Rushing to the others, he shook them awake. "I saw something. A man. No, something. Down the hall." "Calm down," Blake muttered, barely looking up. "It's just the war getting to you." But Martin knew what he had seen, and somewhere, in the depths of the bunker, the whispering hadn't stopped. The next day, the bunker felt even colder. The air seemed heavier, suffocating. Martin couldn't shake the image of the ghostly figure from the night before, and though the others brushed it off, he caught the way they exchanged uneasy glances. Harris was the first to crack. He had been pacing near the back of the bunker, muttering under his breath again, when he froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The others looked up, confused. "I swear I just heard crying." Blake stood, walking over. "There's nothing here but us. You're imagining things." But Martin wasn't so sure. He had heard something too, a faint, distant sobbing, like a woman's voice echoing from deeper within the bunker. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Harris bolted, rushing toward the sound. "Wait!" Martin shouted, chasing after him, the others following close behind. They found Harris standing in front of a rusted door they hadn't opened in weeks. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "I saw someone in there," he stammered. The door creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark and damp, lined with old supplies and discarded gear from soldiers long gone. At first, it seemed empty, but then Martin saw them. Shadows moved in the corners, faint and transparent, like soldiers from another time. One was cradling his chest, his uniform soaked with blood. Another staggered forward, his eyes glazed over, staring right through them. As the apparitions flickered in and out of view, the men stepped back in horror. Harris collapsed to his knees. "They're real, they're real." The ghosts vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving only silence. But this time, no one could deny it. The bunker was haunted, and the dead weren't resting. The apparitions no longer appeared only in the dark corners of the bunker. They moved freely now, as if the walls themselves had come alive with memories of war and death. Each encounter grew more vivid, more chilling. Every soldier in the bunker had seen them by now. The dead walked among the living, replaying their final moments over and over. Martin lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The air felt thick, pressing down on his chest. It wasn't just exhaustion. Something was wrong. He sat up, his heart pounding in his ears. That's when he heard it again, a whisper. "Help us." This time, it wasn't just a vague sound in the distance. The voice was right next to him. Turning slowly, he saw a figure standing near the entrance to the bunker's rear chambers. It was one of the ghosts, a soldier, but not from his unit. His uniform was tattered, faded, the insignia unrecognizable. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he looked straight at Martin, as if pleading. "What do you want?" Martin whispered, his throat dry. The ghost stepped closer, his body flickering as though struggling to stay anchored to this world. "We're trapped," the ghost rasped, his voice thick with desperation. "The bunker. It keeps us here. It feeds on us. It needs more souls." Before Martin could react, the figure vanished, leaving him alone in the suffocating dark. The next morning, Martin told the others, but instead of rallying them, the warning only deepened their fear. Blake was pacing, muttering to himself, while Harris sat rocking back and forth, eyes wide, whispering about the ghost's warnings. The men were on edge, and paranoia gripped them all. Whatever had haunted this place for decades wasn't just a presence. It was a predator, and they were its prey. The fear in the bunker was palpable now. No one spoke much anymore, but everyone could feel it. The weight of the dead, the darkness pressing in on them. Martin's mind raced with the ghost's warning. The bunker needs more souls. It explained everything. The apparitions, the suffocating air, the way the walls themselves seemed to watch them. The bunker wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, feeding on death and war, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. Blake, the toughest of them all, had finally snapped. He stood in the middle of the bunker, rifle in hand, pacing in erratic circles. "We can't stay here," he shouted, his voice cracking. "They're coming for us, and not just the enemy. The damn ghosts, they want us dead." "We can't leave," Harris replied, his voice shaking. "There's nowhere to go. We step outside, and the enemy will cut us down in seconds." Martin sat quietly, thinking. The ghosts didn't care about the enemy outside. They wanted the soldiers inside the bunker, the living to feed the dead. The longer they stayed, the closer they came to becoming part of the cursed cycle. They were running out of time. "The bunker's cursed," Martin said, breaking the tense silence. "It's not just haunted. It traps the dead and keeps them here, in some kind of loop. It's feeding on us, just like it did on those soldiers before us." Blake stopped pacing and stared at him, his eyes wild. "So what? We're supposed to just wait here until it takes us too?" "We have to get out," Martin continued, feeling the urgency rising in his chest. "Maybe we don't make it far, but staying here is a death sentence." Blake shook his head. "Running out there is suicide." A sudden noise interrupted them, a loud thud from the back of the bunker. They turned, weapons raised, but what they saw wasn't the enemy. It was one of their own, a soldier who had been silent for days, now standing in the doorway, pale and shaking. "I'm staying," he said, his voice hollow. "If I die here, maybe I can stop this." "No." Martin lunged toward him, but it was too late. The soldier stepped into the darkness, disappearing into the depths of the bunker. Blake turned to Martin. "We have to go. Now." With no time left, the choice was clear. They would make one last desperate attempt to escape, knowing the ghosts and the enemy waited on both sides. The decision was made. They couldn't stay in the bunker any longer. Every moment inside felt like death was tightening its grip, and the ghosts were growing stronger. Martin, Blake, and Harris prepared themselves for the run. The bunker doors, long rusted and barely functional, stood between them and the open battlefield beyond. The enemy was still out there, but the real terror lay behind them, in the shadows of the cursed bunker. Martin tightened his grip on his rifle. "On my count," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. They pushed open the bunker door. The cold night air hit their faces like a slap, the sudden openness almost disorienting after days trapped in the suffocating bunker. The enemy's lines were somewhere in the dark, but there was no sign of movement yet. They sprinted across the broken ground, hearts racing. The only sound their labored breathing and the crunch of dirt underfoot. Behind them, the bunker loomed, as if it watched their every step. A burst of gunfire shattered the silence, and Harris fell. Martin dove to the ground, pulling him into cover, but it was too late. The enemy had spotted them. Blake fired back, his rifle rattling in the night, but they were pinned. "We're not going to make it," Blake growled, his voice grim. "We should have stayed." Martin looked back at the bunker. The door had creaked open wider, as though beckoning them back. He could see the figures now, ghostly shadows, watching, waiting. "No," Martin said, determination surging through him. "We keep moving. I'd rather die out here than in that cursed place." They pushed forward again, through gunfire and darkness, fighting for their last chance at freedom. Martin survived, but barely. The enemy had pulled back by the time reinforcements finally arrived. The shattered remnants of his platoon were gone. Blake, Harris, all of them, either claimed by bullets or by the bunker itself. Martin didn't remember much of the final moments, just flashes of light, the sound of gunfire, and the cold presence of the ghosts lingering behind him. He was shipped home, a lone survivor with medals that felt like lead on his chest. The war might have ended for him, but the real battle had followed him across oceans and through the ruins of war. It was quieter now. Martin spent his days trying to forget, but the memories never let him rest. He couldn't escape the feeling that the bunker still had its claws in him. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he'd wake up drenched in sweat, feeling the same cold draft from that cursed place. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear the whispering again. One evening, long after the war, Martin visited a memorial for fallen soldiers. Rows of names etched in stone stretched before him, each one a reminder of lives lost, sacrifices made. But as he stood there, staring at the names, a familiar coldness swept over him. He turned, heart pounding, and there, just on the edge of the memorial, he saw it. A figure, pale and ghostly, dressed in the same faded uniform from the bunker. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "We're still waiting." Martin's breath caught. He blinked, and the figure was gone, but the weight remained. The bunker hadn't let go of him after all. It never would. The dead never stopped calling, and deep down, he knew he would one day answer. The roar of the surf was drowned out by the sound of gunfire and explosions as the landing craft ramp crashed into the waves. Lieutenant Daniel Graves took a breath, tightening his grip on his rifle as the soldiers in his unit surged forward onto the beaches of Normandy. The world around him was chaos. Men screaming, bodies hitting the ground, the sand soaked in blood. "Move! Get to the dunes!" Graves shouted, urging his men forward. His voice barely carried above the cacophony of battle, but they moved. Graves' squad scrambled across the sand, narrowly dodging mortar fire. For a moment, the chaos seemed overwhelming, the sheer brutality of war crashing down on him like the unforgiving tide. He watched as the soldier to his right, a kid barely out of high school, fell in a heap, dead before he hit the ground. Graves pushed forward, leading what remained of his squad toward the tree line. Bullets zipped past his ears as they ducked for cover near a ridge of sand dunes. His heartbeat pounded in his chest, but the survival instinct kicked in. The beach was hell, but they had to push inland. Orders were clear. Secure the forest behind the beachhead. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the gunfire behind them began to fade. The sounds of the battle became a distant echo, leaving only the heavy breathing of the soldiers and the oppressive silence of the trees. Graves wiped the sweat from his brow, noticing the eerie stillness around them. The air felt thick, almost stagnant, and the sky had taken on a strange reddish hue as the sun dipped below the horizon. He glanced up, catching a glimpse of a blood-red moon rising through the branches. "Keep moving," he said, trying to shake off the feeling. The mission wasn't over yet. The forest enveloped them in shadow, the distant sounds of battle fading entirely as the soldiers ventured deeper into the trees. Lieutenant Graves kept his rifle raised, eyes scanning the surroundings, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of enemy patrols. Just the oppressive quiet. The reddish glow from the rising blood moon filtered through the dense canopy, casting an unsettling light on the forest floor. "Sir, this place feels wrong," Private Martinez muttered, gripping his weapon tightly as he scanned the shadows. His voice carried a tremor, though he tried to hide it. "Stay sharp," Graves replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Martinez was right. The air felt heavier with each step they took, as though the forest itself was watching them. They moved cautiously for another mile, navigating through thick undergrowth and uneven terrain, when Corporal Hayes, who had been scouting ahead, waved the group to a stop. "Lieutenant, you need to see this," Hayes called out, his voice uneasy. Graves stepped forward, pushing through the foliage until he reached the small clearing ahead. There, half hidden by vines and moss, stood a large stone altar. It was ancient, weathered by time, its surface covered in strange, jagged carvings. Dark stains marked the top, almost as if blood had been spilled there recently. Graves felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. "What the hell is that?" Sergeant Carter muttered, stepping up beside him. "Looks old, real old," Hayes said, his gaze fixed on the carvings. "And wrong. This thing shouldn't be here." Graves approached cautiously, the unsettling feeling growing stronger the closer he got. He couldn't explain it, but something about the altar felt alive, as though it pulsed faintly with some dark, ancient energy. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. "We move on. This has nothing to do with our mission," Graves said, but his voice wavered slightly. As the men prepared to continue, Graves stole one last glance at the altar. The red moon cast a dim glow on the stone, and for a brief moment it seemed to pulse. The squad pressed deeper into the forest, the oppressive silence following them. Lieutenant Graves led the way, but the weight of the strange altar lingered in his mind. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was pushing back against their advance. The blood moon, now fully risen, bathed everything in its eerie red glow. "Feels like we've been walking in circles," Private Martinez whispered. His voice trembled more noticeably now. "I swear we've passed that same tree before." Graves ignored him, focusing on the path ahead, but he couldn't deny the unease growing in his gut. The trees, tall and foreboding, seemed to shift in the dim light. Every rustle of leaves made him grip his rifle tighter. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Then it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint whisper carried on the wind. Graves stopped in his tracks, raising a hand to signal silence. The men fell still, listening. The whispering grew louder, but the language was foreign, guttural, like something from another time. He glanced at Sergeant Carter, whose furrowed brow showed he heard it too. "Do you hear that?" Corporal Hayes asked, stepping forward. "It's coming from—" A shadow darted between the trees, fast and silent. Graves snapped his rifle up, aiming into the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no answer. Suddenly, Private Martinez gasped, stumbling backward. "I saw someone. A man, dressed in armor. Old armor. He was right there." He pointed frantically into the woods, but the shadows only deepened, revealing nothing. "Get it together, Martinez," Graves said, though his own unease grew. He scanned the area, but there was no one. "Sir, I don't like this," Sergeant Carter muttered under his breath. "We need to get out of here." They pressed forward again, but the forest seemed to close in around them. No matter how far they walked, they kept ending up back near the altar. Time became a blur, minutes and hours indistinguishable. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows moved more frequently, always just out of sight. Private Martinez began muttering to himself, shaking uncontrollably. "He's following us. I saw him again. He's from another time. He's coming for us." Graves clenched his jaw, trying to keep control of the situation. The sense of dread was growing, tightening its grip on him with every step they took. "We're circling back on ourselves," Corporal Hayes said, his voice laced with panic. "We're not leaving this place. We're trapped." Graves glanced up at the blood moon, its glow stronger than before, casting the entire forest in a deep, crimson light. It felt as though the moon itself was watching them, feeding off their fear. "Stay calm," Graves ordered, but the look in his men's eyes said they no longer believed him. And maybe, he thought, he didn't believe himself anymore either. The forest thickened as the squad continued onward, though the air felt tighter, suffocating them with an unshakable sense of dread. Lieutenant Graves led in silence, pushing aside his growing fear. His soldiers followed in uneven steps, their breaths heavy and erratic. He couldn't show weakness, not now. As they pushed through the dense foliage, they stumbled upon a clearing, where a dilapidated stone cabin stood, barely visible through the thick vines that wrapped around its crumbling walls. The men exchanged wary glances, the structure out of place in the middle of the forest. A faint light flickered from inside. "Stay here," Graves ordered, nodding to Sergeant Carter to follow him. They approached the cabin cautiously, rifles at the ready. As Graves reached the doorway, the heavy wooden door creaked open slightly, revealing a figure inside. An old man, hunched and shivering, wrapped in a torn blanket. His eyes were wide and wild, darting between the soldiers. His face, lined with deep wrinkles, looked as ancient as the forest itself. "You shouldn't be here," the old man whispered, his voice raspy, trembling. Graves stepped forward. "What are you doing out here? This area is under military occupation. Are you lost?" The old man shook his head violently. "No, no. It's you who are lost. The blood moon rises again. This place, it is not for the living." His eyes locked onto Graves, sharp with fear. "The blood sacrifice has begun." Graves frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The altar you found," the old man continued, voice shaking. "Centuries ago, this land was a battlefield, a war that never ended. The people here sacrifice their enemies to appease an ancient force, but it is never satisfied. When the blood moon returns, the spirits come with it. They walk again, soldiers of every war, bound to this place forever." Sergeant Carter shifted uneasily. "You expect us to believe that?" The old man's eyes gleamed with something dark, something desperate. "Do you hear them? The whispers of the dead? They call to you, don't they?" Graves felt a cold shiver down his spine. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being followed. It all began to make horrible sense. The bloodshed of D-Day had stirred something ancient, something far worse than the war they were fighting. "We need to leave," Graves said, backing out of the cabin. He grabbed Carter by the arm. "We can't stay here." As they turned to leave, the old man's voice rose in a rasping wail. "You cannot escape. You are already part of it now. The moon has chosen you." Graves glanced up at the blood moon hanging low in the sky. The glow seemed even brighter, casting long, unnatural shadows across the forest. He could feel it now, a force beyond his comprehension, a hunger that had been awakened by the endless bloodshed of war. "We need to get back to the others," Graves muttered, urgency pressing his words. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were trapped in something far worse than enemy territory. By the time Lieutenant Graves and Sergeant Carter returned to the squad, the blood moon had risen fully, casting an unholy red glow over everything. The forest felt alive, its dark branches twisting like claws in the dim light. The rest of the men were gathered near the altar, eyes wide with a combination of fear and confusion. Graves tried to steady his voice as he relayed the old man's warning. "This place is cursed. That altar we found, it's connected to some ancient blood ritual. The old man said the spirits are drawn out when the blood moon rises. We've stirred something, and now it's hunting us." The men exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale in the crimson light. "Spirits? You believe this crap?" Corporal Hayes asked, his voice shaking despite his attempt at bravado. Graves didn't answer immediately. "I don't know what's out here, but we've all seen things. We've all heard the whispers." Private Martinez stood up abruptly, his face ashen. "We're being followed. I've seen him. The one in the armor. He's coming closer. I can feel him watching us." Before Graves could respond, a loud crack split the silence, like a tree snapping in half. The men spun around, rifles raised, but there was nothing. Only the shifting shadows of the forest. The wind began to howl through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of distant footsteps, heavy and deliberate. "Form up," Graves barked, but as he gave the order, the ground beneath them seemed to pulse, as if the forest itself was alive. The whispers grew louder, no longer just faint murmurs but a chorus of voices, some chanting in languages none of them understood, others screaming in agony. It was as though the entire history of war, of violence and death, was crying out all at once. Private Martinez snapped, letting out a high-pitched scream. "He's here! He's here!" He raised his rifle, pointing wildly into the darkness, firing blindly. Graves lunged at him, grabbing the rifle before he could waste more ammunition, but the fear had already infected the others. Corporal Hayes's eyes went wide, his expression distant. "I see them. Soldiers, they're fighting, but they're not us. Not German. They're from another time." Graves turned to see what Hayes was staring at, and his blood ran cold. Through the thick red haze of the moonlight, spectral figures began to appear between the trees. Warriors in armor, some in medieval chainmail, others in Roman legionnaire garb, still others from eras he didn't recognize. All locked in a ghostly battle, their movements fluid yet unnatural, like shadows from a nightmare. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the blood moon. "We're losing it," Sergeant Carter shouted, trying to pull the men back to reality. But it was no use. The spectral soldiers were everywhere now, flickering in and out of sight, locked in combat that transcended time. And then, one of them, a massive figure in dark armor, turned, locking its glowing eyes on Graves. In that moment, the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to snap. Graves felt himself being pulled into a horrifying vision. He saw himself, but not as the man he was. He was dressed in ancient armor, his hands bloodied from a battle long past. And then, just as quickly, the vision faded, leaving him breathless and on the verge of collapse. "We need to destroy the altar," Graves gasped, struggling to steady himself. "It's the only way." But the forest had other plans. As the men tried to regroup, the ground beneath them began to shake. The trees swayed violently, and the whispers turned to shrieks. Something was coming, something much worse than the spectral soldiers. Private Martinez, completely lost to madness, broke from the group, running wildly into the forest. His screams echoed in the distance before they were abruptly cut off. "We're next," Corporal Hayes muttered, his eyes glazed with fear. Graves knew they had no time left. Whatever was out there, it was closing in fast. They had one shot to end this nightmare, and it would have to be soon, or they would all become part of the cursed battlefield. Lieutenant Graves moved swiftly, his mind racing as he formulated a desperate plan. They had to destroy the altar. It was their only chance to break the curse. He signaled Sergeant Carter and Corporal Hayes to follow, their faces tight with fear but resolute. The forest closed in around them as the spectral figures drifted among the trees, their battle raging endlessly. Graves knelt by his pack, hands shaking as he pulled out the explosives. He looked at Carter. "We'll set charges around the altar. Once it's blown, We make for the edge of the forest. With any luck, it'll stop whatever this is. And if it doesn't? Carter asked, his voice low. Then we're already dead, Graves muttered, not meeting his eyes. They moved quickly, placing the explosives around the stone structure. The altar's surface seemed to pulse under the blood moon's light, as if the stone itself was alive. Graves couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and malevolent was watching them. As they worked, the ground trembled again. The whispers returned, louder than before, filling the air with a language that made Graves' skin crawl. He glanced up at the moon, now a deep crimson, hanging low in the sky like a bleeding wound. Time was running out. Suddenly, a loud rustling in the trees snapped them to attention. Out of the shadows, Private Martinez staggered back into the clearing. His face was twisted with terror, his eyes wide and unfocused. "He's here," Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's coming." Before anyone could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness. Corporal Hayes, his face contorted in agony, his eyes glowing with the same red light that radiated from the moon. But this wasn't Hayes anymore. His body moved unnaturally, twisted by whatever ancient force had claimed him. His voice, when it came, was not his own. It was deeper, darker. "The blood must continue," Hayes rasped, his gaze locking onto Graves. "There is no end to the sacrifice." Graves barely had time to react before Hayes lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. They struggled, the weight of Hayes's body pressing Graves down into the earth. His glowing eyes burned into Graves, filled with the rage of countless centuries. The altar pulsed violently, as if feeding off the battle. Sergeant Carter rushed forward, pulling Hayes off and hurling him back, but the effort cost him. Hayes, or the thing that controlled him, moved with inhuman strength, knocking Carter aside. Carter groaned, blood spilling from a deep gash in his side. Graves scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had no choice. If they didn't detonate the explosives now, they'd all be consumed by whatever cursed force was driving this madness. As Hayes advanced on them, his body contorting with each step, Graves grabbed the detonator. "We end this. Now." With a final glance at Carter, who nodded weakly, Graves slammed his hand down on the detonator. The explosives detonated in a deafening roar, the force of the blast throwing him to the ground. The altar shattered, stone flying in all directions as a blinding red light exploded from its core. For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped. The earth stood still. But as the dust settled, Graves' heart sank. The blood moon hung above them, unchanged, its terrible glow bathing the forest in its crimson light. And from the ruins of the altar, something stirred. A deep, guttural howl echoed through the trees, and the ground trembled once more. Graves struggled to his feet, his eyes widening in horror as the spectral figures reappeared, more vivid than before. They weren't just fighting now, they were coming for him. The curse hadn't ended. It had only grown stronger. The explosion echoed through the forest, but Lieutenant Graves' body was numb, the sound distant and hollow in his ears. The altar lay in ruins, its stones scattered, but the blood moon still glowed ominously above, bathing the world in red. The spectral warriors, once shadows in the trees, now moved closer, their ghostly forms more tangible, more menacing. They weren't bound to the altar, they were bound to the bloodshed itself. Graves stumbled to his feet, his vision swimming. Beside him, Sergeant Carter lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Corporal Hayes, or what had been Hayes, was nowhere to be seen, his body consumed in the explosion. Graves looked around, hoping for some sign that the curse had been broken, that the nightmare had ended. But the whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that pressed against his skull like nails. He could feel the weight of their presence, an eternal force that fed on the violence and death that had soaked into the soil of this cursed land for centuries. The blood must continue. The voice, deep and ancient, echoed in his mind. Graves turned toward the ruins of the altar. In the red light of the moon, the ground seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself was alive, throbbing with an insatiable hunger. The sacrifice had not been ended. It had been renewed. Graves felt the weight of it settle on him. The war, the destruction, the endless cycle of violence. It had all been leading to this. He was part of something much older, something far beyond the war he had been fighting. This land had been cursed long before D-Day, and the bloodshed of the invasion had only awakened it. The dead, from every war that had ever touched this soil, were bound to it now. A low groan escaped from Carter, pulling Graves back to the present. He knelt beside his friend, shaking him gently. "Carter, stay with me. We have to move." But Carter's eyes were distant, his face pale. "We didn't stop it, did we?" he rasped, blood staining his lips. "We're part of it now." Graves swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't have an answer. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the blood moon began to fade, its red hue dissolving into the soft gray of morning. The spectral figures, once menacing and solid, began to blur and flicker, their forms dissolving back into the shadows. Graves struggled to his feet, pulling Carter up beside him. Together, they staggered through the forest, heading for what they hoped was safety. The silence of the woods was oppressive, but the whispers had faded, for now. Hours later, they stumbled out of the forest and onto a dirt road. Allied forces were there, patrolling the area, and when Graves and Carter appeared, they were quickly surrounded and escorted to safety. But as they were led away, Graves glanced back at the forest. The trees stood tall and still, but something lingered in the air, a heaviness that clung to the land. The blood moon might have vanished with the dawn, but Graves knew it would return. The curse was far from over. As he was loaded into the back of a jeep, Carter resting beside him, Graves stared out at the horizon, the weight of the curse settling heavily in his chest. The forest, the altar, the ancient sacrifice. It was all still there, waiting. He and his men had merely been caught in its cycle, and deep down, Graves knew that no matter how far he ran, he would never truly escape it. Some wars never end. The jungle was an unforgiving beast, its thick canopy swallowing every sound except the low hum of insects. Sergeant Jackson marched at the head of his squad, his rifle slung across his chest, eyes scanning the shadows cast by the dense foliage. The heat was oppressive, clinging to his skin like a wet blanket, and the air tasted like decay. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the jungle itself was conspiring to slow them down. "We're close," Jackson muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure. The map in his hand was little more than a vague sketch, and the jungle had a way of distorting everything. Landmarks vanished, paths twisted in on themselves. But the mission was clear: find the weapons cache and destroy it. That's what command had ordered, and Jackson wasn't one to question orders, even if something about this place felt wrong. Behind him, Private Kowalski stumbled over a root, his heavy breathing breaking the silence. "I swear this place is alive, Sarge," he whispered, glancing nervously at the trees. "Feels like it's watching us." Jackson didn't respond. Kowalski was young, fresh out of basic, and already cracking under the pressure. The jungle had that effect on men. It wasn't just the enemy you had to worry about. It was the land itself, suffocating and ancient, like it had seen countless men before them come and go. Mostly go. "Keep it together, Kowalski," Corporal Harris barked from the back. His voice was steady, but Jackson could sense the tension underneath it. Harris had been with Jackson through the worst of it, and though he was solid under fire, even he seemed on edge. The whole squad was. As they moved deeper into the undergrowth, Jackson caught sight of something through the trees. A stone structure, almost entirely hidden by vines and moss. It was old, far older than anything they expected to find in this jungle. An ancient temple, its entrance dark and gaping like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Jackson held up a fist, signaling the squad to stop. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the buzz of insects and the occasional drip of water from the leaves. He stared at the temple for a long moment, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. "Stay sharp," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't supposed to be here, that whatever lay inside that temple wasn't meant to be disturbed. The night pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. The squad had set up camp just outside the temple's entrance, their small fire offering little comfort against the vastness of the jungle. Shadows danced along the temple walls, twisting and flickering with the flames, but Jackson's eyes kept drifting back to the darkness beyond the firelight. There was something unsettling about the place, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Kowalski sat closest to the fire, nervously fidgeting with his helmet. "Anyone else hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Jackson stiffened. He had heard it too, but he wasn't about to admit that. "It's just the jungle," he said, more to convince himself than Kowalski. "Keep your head in the game." "No, it's not the jungle," Kowalski insisted, eyes wide. "It's voices. They're whispering my name, Sarge. I swear." "Cut the crap, Kowalski," Harris snapped, his patience fraying. "The jungle plays tricks on you. You'll hear all kinds of things out here if you let it get to you." Jackson nodded, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The voices Kowalski claimed to hear, Jackson had heard them too. Faint, barely more than a breeze through the trees, but distinct enough to set his nerves on edge. He shifted in his spot, scanning the perimeter, trying to shake the growing sense of dread creeping up on him. Hours dragged by, the night growing colder and darker. Jackson stood watch, his gaze never leaving the temple. His mind drifted back to the men he'd lost on a mission just like this. How he'd promised their families that their deaths weren't in vain. But standing in front of that ancient structure, he felt the weight of his past failures closing in on him, like the temple itself was pulling him back into those memories. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind him. Jackson spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there. Just more jungle, dense and unyielding. Then, from the direction of the temple, a soft muttering reached his ears. He turned slowly and saw Private Kowalski, standing near the temple's entrance, his back to the squad. "Kowalski?" Jackson called out, stepping forward. "What the hell are you doing?" Kowalski didn't respond. He stood motionless, his hands at his sides, staring at the stone altar inside the temple. Jackson approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the private, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kowalski, snap out of it." The private's eyes were wide open, but they were vacant, as if he wasn't really there. His lips moved in silent prayer or incantation, the words a guttural whisper in a language Jackson couldn't understand. "Kowalski." Jackson shook him hard, and suddenly, the young man collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing in a violent seizure. "Medic!" Jackson shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The rest of the squad rushed over, but Jackson could already feel the heavy weight of dread settling in his gut. Something had gotten into Kowalski, and whatever it was, it had come from that temple. The jungle was different in the daylight, but no less oppressive. The thick undergrowth seemed to close in tighter around them, the trees warping into twisted shapes that Jackson swore hadn't been there the day before. They moved cautiously, but the sense of unease gnawed at every step. Kowalski walked in a daze, supported by two other soldiers, his eyes vacant and unfocused after the night's episode. Jackson pressed forward, but his gut told him they were heading in the wrong direction. Every landmark, every familiar path, seemed to disappear as soon as they turned a corner. It felt like the jungle was twisting itself into a maze, a living thing bent on trapping them within its depths. "We should have never gone near that temple," Corporal Harris muttered from behind, his tone sharper than usual. "We're being hunted by something, Jackson. You feel it, don't you?" Jackson ignored him, refusing to give voice to his own fears. The jungle was playing tricks on them, sure, but it wasn't the first time a mission had gone sideways. They just needed to keep moving, to push through whatever strange grip this place had on them. "We'll find the cache. Stay focused," he ordered, though the words rang hollow in his own ears. But Harris wasn't done. "No, this is different," he snapped, his voice rising. "We're not just lost. We're being turned around on purpose. That thing we saw last night, that wasn't normal, Jackson." Jackson stopped, turning to face his second-in-command. Harris's face was pale, his eyes wide and frantic. The others were starting to notice too. Kowalski's condition, the strange whispers, the paths that seemed to change direction on a whim. "Calm down, Harris," Jackson warned. "The jungle plays tricks on your mind. We've been through worse." But before he could say more, one of the other soldiers, Private Lee, called out from the rear. "Sarge, you need to see this." Jackson jogged over to where Lee stood, rifle raised, staring into the trees. His breath caught in his throat. Standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the mist, was the outline of a man. No, several men. Their figures were blurred, indistinct, but familiar in a way that made Jackson's blood run cold. They were dressed in old uniforms he hadn't seen in months, since the day he'd lost his squad. The figures moved slowly through the jungle, their footsteps silent as if they weren't truly there. And then, one of them turned to face Jackson, and his breath caught in his throat. It was Martinez, one of the men Jackson had lost on that fateful mission. His face was gaunt, hollow, as though death had stolen all that made him human. He stared at Jackson, eyes filled with accusation. "No, no way," Jackson muttered, taking a step back. "Martinez is dead. I saw him die." Harris stepped up beside him, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is this, Sarge?" The figures disappeared into the fog as quickly as they had come, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence of the jungle behind. Jackson's hands shook as he tightened his grip on his rifle. It wasn't possible. Martinez was dead. They had buried him. But now the jungle was showing him things that shouldn't be there. The same jungle that had twisted their path, that had driven Kowalski mad. "We need to get the hell out of here," Harris said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever this place is, it's messing with our heads." Jackson didn't argue. Deep down, he knew Harris was right. But there was no going back. Not yet. Jackson knew they couldn't keep running in circles. The jungle seemed to fold in on itself, trapping them in an endless loop of fear and confusion. The distant sound of the temple's stone walls whispered through his mind, beckoning him. He had to confront whatever was haunting them, whatever had seeped into the minds of his men. "We're going back to the temple," Jackson said, his voice firm, though the knot in his stomach tightened with each word. Harris balked, his face twisting in disbelief. "You're out of your mind, Jackson. That place is cursed. We're lucky to have gotten out once." Jackson locked eyes with him. "We didn't get out, Harris. We're still stuck in this nightmare. The only way to end this is to face it. Whatever's in that temple, it's not letting us go." The squad was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Private Lee looked terrified. Kowalski was still a shell of himself, but they followed. They had no choice. By the time they reached the temple, the sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows over the stone structure. The ancient ruin seemed more ominous now, as though it had grown in the hours since they'd left it. Jackson felt the air grow heavier as they approached, a stifling presence that settled into his bones. "I'll go in alone," Jackson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He couldn't risk taking the rest of the squad with him. They were already too far gone. Kowalski's blank stares, Harris's frayed nerves. This was on him now. Harris tried to object, but Jackson silenced him with a glance. "If I'm not back in an hour, you leave. Understand?" The corporal nodded reluctantly, stepping back as Jackson entered the temple's gaping maw. Inside, the air was thick and still, the silence pressing in from all sides. Jackson moved deeper, his flashlight flickering across the stone walls covered in strange carvings. His heart pounded in his chest, the memories of his lost men echoing through his mind. The faces of Martinez, Jenkins, and Fields flashed before him, the men he had failed. Suddenly, the ground seemed to shift beneath him, and he found himself standing in a vast chamber. The stone altar stood at its center, bathed in a cold, unnatural light. And there, waiting in the shadows, was the thing that had been haunting them. It emerged slowly, a dark figure that morphed and twisted as it approached. Its form was fluid, flickering between the shapes of his fallen comrades. Martinez stepped forward first, his eyes hollow and accusing, his face a mask of agony. "You left us," Martinez whispered, his voice a ghostly echo. "You abandoned us." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. "No, I didn't. I tried to save you." The figure shifted again, becoming Jenkins, his face pale and bloodied, just as it had been in Jackson's nightmares. "You let us die," Jenkins hissed, his voice filled with hatred. "And now you will join us." The entity circled him, warping into the faces of all the men he had lost, each one a reflection of his deepest guilt and regret. It was feeding off his pain, growing stronger with each passing moment. Jackson's mind reeled as the weight of his failures bore down on him. "No," Jackson muttered, forcing himself to stand tall. "This is my guilt, my burden, but I won't let you control me anymore." The faces sneered at him, but Jackson stood his ground. "I know I failed them. I know I can't bring them back, but I'm not going to let you use that against me." The entity hesitated, its form flickering uncertainly. Jackson stepped forward, his voice stronger now. "I can live with the guilt, but I won't live under your control." With those words, the light around the altar dimmed, and the air seemed to shift. The entity, once towering and terrifying, began to dissolve, its hold on Jackson weakening. He could feel it slipping away, retreating back into the darkness from where it had come. But the damage had been done. Jackson knew he had broken free, but the scars of the encounter and the war would remain. Jackson emerged from the temple, the jungle's heavy air pressing against his skin once again. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though each one was a test to see if he was truly free of the nightmare. His mind buzzed with a strange sense of calm, the oppressive presence that had haunted him and his men now reduced to a distant whisper. The squad was waiting just outside, Harris the first to spot him. His face was a mix of relief and disbelief. "You did it, Sarge," Harris said, though there was an edge to his voice, as if he wasn't entirely sure what Jackson had faced inside. Jackson nodded, but he didn't speak. There were no words for what had happened in the depths of that ancient temple, no way to explain the dark entity, the guilt, or the faces of the dead that had torn at his mind. All he knew was that they had to leave, now, before the jungle changed its mind about letting them go. "Move out," Jackson ordered, his voice hoarse. The men gathered their gear without hesitation, eager to put as much distance between them and the temple as possible. Kowalski had regained some of his senses, though his eyes still held a haunted, distant look. The others were exhausted, their faces pale and drawn, but they followed Jackson's lead, trudging through the thick undergrowth. The jungle, once disorienting and malevolent, seemed quieter now, less threatening, though its stillness only added to the sense of unease. They walked in silence for hours, the oppressive atmosphere slowly lifting as they moved farther from the temple. Yet, despite the physical distance, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with them. The jungle had released them, but he could feel the weight of the encounter lingering in the back of his mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. As night fell again, they reached the edge of a small clearing. Jackson called for a halt, the squad setting up camp one final time. Harris sat down beside him, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What happened back there, Sarge?" he asked, his voice low. "What did you see?" Jackson stared into the flickering fire, the flames casting long shadows across the jungle floor. "It doesn't matter," he said after a long pause. "It's over now." Harris looked like he wanted to press further, but something in Jackson's tone stopped him. Instead, he nodded and walked away, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. The fire crackled softly, and Jackson felt the exhaustion settling into his bones. His eyes drifted closed, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. But just as sleep began to claim him, he heard it, a faint, familiar whisper. His eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The jungle was quiet, but the whisper was unmistakable. It called his name, just as it had in the temple. Slowly, Jackson stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a step toward the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the thick trees beyond. There, in the distance, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, stood a figure, a shadow, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was Martinez. His gaunt, hollow face stared back at Jackson, eyes filled with that same accusation, that same unrelenting guilt. Jackson blinked, his breath catching in his throat. When he opened his eyes again, the figure was gone. But the whisper remained, carried on the wind, just faint enough to make him doubt his own senses. He knew, then, that the jungle hadn't truly let him go. The entity may have retreated, but it wasn't gone. It never would be. Jackson sat back down, staring into the fire. The others slept soundly, unaware of the shadow that still lingered, but Jackson knew better. The horrors of war, both real and supernatural, left their marks. Some scars never healed. The jungle was silent, but in the silence, Jackson could still hear the whispers. They would always be with him.